As we move on to the next segment of the program, I'll say over the past few years, we've really been thrilled to partner with the national nonprofit All for Ed, which is committed to expanding equitable educational opportunities. We've been particularly focused on policies to better prepare students for college and career. You may have seen the policy recommendations that we put out with input from many people in this room. And now we're expanding our work to focus on resource equity in schools more broadly. So that leads us to our next conversation, spotlighting the huge investments that are being made and just approved in Maryland and how that state can be a model for distributing resources more equitably. So welcome to Enrique Chaurand, Vice President of Communications at All for Ed, along with two New Deal leaders who are at the forefront of the effort in Maryland, Senate President Bill Ferguson and the new Comptroller-elect for the state of Maryland, Brooke Lierman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. ¿Lo vamos a hacer en inglés o en español? ¿Cuál prefieres? Ambos, okay. My man right here, okay. Good afternoon. My name is Enrique Chaurand, and I am the Vice President of Communications and Marketing at All for Ed. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. All for Ed, in case you don't know, is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to ensuring all students graduate from high school prepared for success in post-secondary education and beyond, especially those who have been historically marginalized. For the past several years, we have been fortunate to work with New Deal on issues pertaining to college and career readiness, and today's session is part of our partnership focused on resource equity. Together, we aim to support state and local policymakers in identifying ways to ensure equitable investments in education in historically underserved communities. I would like to thank our colleagues at the Kellogg Foundation and the Joyce Foundation for supporting this work. Evidence shows that there are major disparities in how the nation funds public education, as you all know. A study that was published by EdBuild found that for every student enrolled, the average non-white school district receives $226,000 less than a white school district. These funding gaps mean that children of color are less likely to access a host of opportunities, from high-quality early education to AP courses and dual enrollment opportunities. Several states are making an effort to change how they fund our schools, like Maryland. Today, we are going to hear from New Deal leaders from the state of Maryland about their efforts to make the state's funding formula more equitable. As was said, we have Senator Bill Ferguson, President of the Maryland State Senate, representing areas in downtown Baltimore. Before his post in the Senate, Senator Ferguson was the second youngest Senate president in the state's history. Did I get that right? And he taught U.S. history and government to 9th and 10th graders. As was also said, we have with us Comptroller-elect Brooke Lierman, who is a civil rights attorney by training. She is the mother of 2 children and a 2-term state delegate. She is the first woman independently elected to one of the state's 3 statewide offices. I was going to say, let's give them both a hand, but let's give them both a hand, right? I also can vouch that Comptroller-elect Lierman worked very hard during this election season. I saw her at my Metro stop, I think at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, out there pressing the flesh and meeting with voters. So congratulations again. Thank you. So before we begin, I would like to give both Senator Ferguson and Comptroller-elect an opportunity for some opening statements. And why don't we start with you, Senator Comptroller Lierman? Sure.
Brooke is just easier. Comptroller-elect is a mouthful.
Yeah, especially for someone whose first language is Spanish.
Controller.
Exactly.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the New Deal for all of your work on education reform and education supports over the years, and thanks for having us speak today. We certainly hope that we can be helpful to all of you, all the state legislators and county and officials out there to think through what education reform and what education policy can look like. In Maryland, we have gone through a multi-year process to get to where we are, having passed legislation. And you will hear us talk about it as either the blueprint for Maryland's future or the Kirwan Commission, which was the commission that we set up to get to where we are to pass the blueprint for Maryland's future. And now we're in the phase where we're actually funding it. But why did this matter, and why did we spend so many years working on it? Well, I'll say I am a public school graduate from Montgomery County Public Schools. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, but then I moved to Baltimore City after law school, and I started looking at the schools that I was going to be sending my kids to and that people were sending their children to, and I couldn't believe it was the same state. It was infuriating, frustrating, devastating to see that both the buildings that kids were going into, but also to hear about the lack of resources that they had. Nobody had art classes in years, and the lack of teacher supports and social supports. And so very quickly, I started educating myself about where we were as a state in funding schools and how we got to this place in Maryland. And I actually didn't go to a book or newspapers. I went to an advocate. I went to an outside advocate, a woman named Bibi Verdery, who had been instrumental in bringing a lawsuit with the ACLU against the state of Maryland for failing to equitably fund city school or state schools, but it was about the city and not funding Baltimore City public schools equitably. And out of that lawsuit that was in the 90s came legislation that created a new funding formula, the Thornton funding formula. And so by the time, and that was in the early 2000s. So by the time I was questioning all of this in, say 2010, everything should have been okay because they'd passed this funding formula in 2000, but they hadn't stuck with it, right? During the Great Recession, they'd stopped adding on the COLA. They weren't funding what they were supposed to do. And so we had gotten so far behind from where we should be. And in fact, Maryland was the only state in the nation that saw its test scores drop in math and reading between 2013 and 2015. So things were really not going well for a state where we've always prided ourselves on our public education. And it wasn't just in Baltimore, but it was especially in some of our lower income areas. So I ran for office and ran for the House of Delegates in 2014. Senator Ferguson is my senator. He is my senator still, too. He will always be. And so they had already started working on developing this commission, and I'll let him sort of talk about his experience and the work, getting it going and where it led. So I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. There's a very helpful testing. Okay, switch. Testing. All right. It was an excellent summary of how we got to where we are. And I've been trying to think, as knowing that this panel would happen, is that you all are dealing with education in your own independent ways. And so, the goal is to not provide just a boring overlay of what happened in Maryland, but maybe learn little bits and pieces. So I was trying to think of things that might be more interesting and replicable about our experience thus far. And I would say, most importantly, we are in the middle of this experience. I am incredibly proud of the work that we are able to do with the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, but really, this is the first year of implementation. So we had this huge win that passed in 2020. Quick aside about the 2020, this was the first year that I was elected to serve as the presiding officer. It was the middle of March, and the Blueprint for Maryland's Future was one of the bills at the end of session that we had to decide whether or not we would pass and fund. And it was March 12th that we were at a place where we thought that the bill would be able to get to the floor. Something happened, we hadn't gotten done with the budget, and we got the news that the state was going to be shutting down, and we had to decide whether or not to keep the session open. And there was an afternoon, after 3 years of work that we had worked on this Blueprint for Maryland's Future. It was the bill for the session. It was the first year that I'd been in this presiding officer role. It was the thing I said, we will not leave Annapolis until we get this thing done. but we had a global pandemic on the horizon, and so then made the decision, we are not going to leave here until we finish this bill. And lo and behold, we did, and we had 5 Republican votes. It was a bipartisan vote. Unfortunately, thank you, Kiefer, our governor vetoed the bill. Kiefer was the governor's legislative liaison. He's a wonderful individual who is thoughtful, pragmatic, works in very bipartisan ways. We overrode the veto. So, and a Democrat. The reason that I say all of this is that we are in a very different place in Maryland than a lot of states, especially, sort of hearing Tim Ryan earlier in Ohio. We had and have a supermajority of Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And so, we have a little bit of an easier path for doing kind of sort of Democratic priorities than a lot of states. I know Georgia and Alabama, and I'm very sympathetic to the challenges there. But I think, from the very outset, our goal with the Blueprint for Maryland's Future was for it to be a bipartisan initiative, was that we wanted to have Republican votes because education is not a partisan issue. The education of Maryland's workforce is fundamental to our long-term economic security. And so we worked very, very, very hard over that period to try and make it a more bipartisan effort. And I think if we hadn't had the pandemic, there was a chance that we may have not had a veto, but it is what it is. And so that's kind of the context. We are a supermajority. We spent 3 years, and the idea of how did we get to this place, as Brooke mentioned, in 2002, we were supposed to review the law that we had 10 years later, so in 2012. Well, in 2012, we were still coming out of the recession, and we knew that there was going to be an additional allocation needed for our education formula, and we were not in a place financially to feel like we were in the best place in the world to put more money in. And we thought that a new Democratic governor would be elected in 2014. And so we thought, well, we can kick it to 2014 with a new administration, and we'll figure it out then. That's not exactly what happened, and we had a different governor elected, and so we had to come up with a new strategy for how are we going to reauthorize our public education funding formula, which is a bipartisan agreed important aspect, but do it in a way that was thoughtful and aggressive. And so that started in 2016. We initiated this commission. 2 years later, we put an initial report, and then another year after that is finally when we had a bill on the Senate floor. So it was really a 4-year process comparing Maryland's outcomes to the globe and to other states. So that was the lens by which we were trying to figure out where are Maryland's gaps. Despite saying we're one of the best education places in the world, are we actually? And then if not, where are the gaps between what's working and where Maryland is?
So I think my first question would be, given the background and how you just laid it out, what were some of the pain points? And you kind of alluded to some of it, but in the process of getting this legislation passed, were there policies that you had to fight especially hard to keep, some that you had to compromise in order to send the bill to the governor's desk?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is relevant for everybody, no matter if you're in a Republican-held or Democratic-held legislature. There's always going to be, when you're in Maryland, it's sometimes House versus Senate, right? But there's always going to be different viewpoints on what needs to happen and what should be in a bill. And one of the important parts, and I think takeaways from this experience, was when we set up the commission, the members of the commission were there to represent the very different interests, right? So there were House members on it and there were Senate members on it, and our Republican governor participated and appointed several members, right? Then there were business interests on it, there were teachers' interests on it, there were, so it was all the school board members, so there were all different interests sort of represented to come together to talk about the challenges. And the charge that we gave the commission was not, how much do we need to fund? And we didn't say to them, this is how much we can increase their funding, figure out what you can do. Instead, we said, how do we build a world-class education, right? And so they were very public in the work that they did. They held public listening sessions all around the state. And so local school districts and parents groups and PTOs got very involved in going to those sessions and saying what they want to see in their kid's school, right? You show up when somebody who has the opportunity to make sure that your kid's going to get an art teacher, you show up and you say, I want my kid to have an art teacher, right? I want a new playground at my school. Those are the things that motivate parents. And when you were talking to business leaders, right, there was a way to bring business to the table as well. And Senator Ferguson was really instrumental in making this happen to make sure that we were making the economic case to business leaders about why it was so important that we have world-class institutions. Because if you want to headquarter your business in Maryland, or if you're a small business owner and you want a workforce, right, you need to be able to attract employees who want to raise their kids here. So I think some of the potential pain points we tried to foresee by putting people on the commission who would represent different areas that could have potentially opposed the bill, right? And so I think there was a lot of thought given to who was on that commission and then the recommendations that were coming out and to building a really big tent. And so a lot of the people who come out who oppose different education policy or funding programs, we try to just bring them in from the very beginning to avoid some of the pain points that could have happened. I mean, of course, there were pain points that still came up, but I think, we did the best that could have been done probably to try to alleviate some of those up front.
Yeah, I would say the other major pain point, but what I think was absolutely essential to the whole construct of what we were trying to do, was that we weren't saying, let's just look at college enrollment rates, or let's just look at early childhood, or let's just look at teacher quality. It really was what creates a world-class system and how do you compare it to the best performers in the world and the best states in the country. And so we landed with 5 separate kind of pillar areas. And so the 5 pillars of this blueprint are early childhood education, getting more resources to students who need it more, ensuring that we have the best and most talented teachers and educators in classrooms, ensuring that we have real pathways with no dead ends for careers and career or college, and then finally, governance and accountability. And so we weren't just dealing with one part of the education system, we were taking all of it at the same time. And so that's why I say it's still a work in progress, because as of the end of next month, every county, we have 24 counties, every county has to put in their plan that has to be approved. And if it is not approved, all of the increased funding that is supposed to go to that district is going to be held. And there's a 7-member board that is their sole responsibility is to determine whether or not to hold back increased funding for the investments for a new system. And all five of these pillars are all being addressed at the exact same time. And so it is a very, very aggressive approach to restructuring an education system set over a 10-year period with goals and metrics and funding kind of predictable throughout. And we'll see. I have a lot of confidence in it, but it's going to be a very interesting experience as schools experience the changes or requests for changes each year and have to make some pretty big adjustments.
So that's it. Okay, I appreciate you. That's a great segue into my next question. So at a time when we have historic influx of education funding, or federal funding, right, because of COVID, to address COVID, but also high inflation and other costs, right, that have to be taken into consideration. Why was it so important to increase education funding and specifically ensure that increases would continue for the next 10 years?
I mean, education is a people business, and you have to pay people, and so it just it's not only about the money, but it's absolutely about the money. And if you want to enhance services, if you want to provide a better service, it is almost guaranteed that in some capacity you are going to have to bring more people to the problem, and that costs money. And so I think we knew that how that money was spent is absolutely essential, and that it was spent equitably, and that it was going where places where kids and families and schools needed it most. That was a core value throughout all of this, but in education, it costs money. And so you sort of make the choice. Do we make the investment now to invest in systems to create, a world-class economy, or do we just hope that we can import people and then the kids that eventually graduate, we figure out what opportunities they have? And so, I mean, that was the case we tried to make from the get-go. Final sort of point on this is, right now in Maryland, one of the wealthiest states in the country, 6 years after high school graduation, roughly 28% of students, only 28, so 1 out of 4, a little bit more than 1 out of 4, are earning an AA degree or a 4-year degree or an industry-recognized credential 6 years after they graduate from high school, one of the wealthiest states in the country. 2 out of 3 jobs being created in Maryland today, right now, require an industry-recognized credential, an AA degree or a BA degree in order to even apply. So if 3/4 of the kids in Maryland cannot apply for 2/3 of the jobs that are being created, that's not an education problem. It is, but it's an economic calamity if you don't do something about it. And so that fundamentally, in my mind, was if you're going to do something about it, you're going to have to spend money, and that's what this was about, and we have to do it with accountability and with real governance, and that was the goal.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add on to that, I think, one of the things that we looked at, and that gets back to, where all of this money is needed and why it's needed, is we did separate out and start researching the difference between poverty and concentrated poverty, which was not something that had been done in our funding formula previously, but is absolutely something that needs to be done in funding formulas to provide more equity. And we saw some interesting allegiances there then, because of course, probably when I say high levels of concentrated poverty, many of you are thinking Baltimore City, and absolutely that is true. But 3 counties on the Eastern Shore have 100% rates of concentrated poverty around their schools, 100%. So there's this interesting alliance between Somerset County and Baltimore City, who have very low, have really high levels of concentrated poverty, and hence need extra funding formula to bring in the social workers, to make sure there's health suites in their schools so their kids can stay healthy and keep coming to school to do that work. And so this extra COVID money, is so important, but we were already so underfunding these schools to begin with, and during COVID, they had so many more challenges and problems, and barriers to overcome, the kids who go to these schools and the teachers and the parents in these communities, that the COVID money is great and really, really important, but just to level fund, right? Just to keep us going. And so the additional money that will come in on a per pupil basis because of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, you get extra bumps based on concentrated poverty, right? To help create more equitable financial situations for the schools that have a large degree of children who are living in areas of concentrated poverty, so that we can also be graduating those students and that we can be breaking that cycle and creating a ready workforce.
So in order to make anything work, you need to have some sort of accountability, oversight, right? And one unique part of this legislation is the establishment of the Accountability and Implementation Board. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you work to ensure that this legislation has the support to be fully implemented over time?
Well, we will see in March of 2023 whether or not it actually is. So one of the interesting things in 2002, as Brooke mentioned with the lawsuit that happened, there was a large influx of dollars, but it was all sort of a grant to each school district. It was not tied to specific outcomes or specific activities. And one of the big findings that I think was different and that we had never done in Maryland before is that we will still have an organization of school districts, but the accountability is school by school and less district by district, which, just sort of speaking candidly, after spending lots of, the last 15 years in education, I've become incredibly skeptical that a district is the unit of change. It's just so very difficult to change things at a district level, but you can change numerous schools inside of a district in order to actually see long-term outcomes change. It's the people in an individual school that make the biggest difference and the investments made at that school. And so that's the unit of accountability that we are shifting to with these new dollars going in. But at the end of the day, because it's about money, the real question will be is if a school or district does not do the things that are required in order to move to a different system, will we actually hold back the money? And that will be the ultimate test. This 7-member board is charged with holding the line. They're not the school board. They're separate. They're appointed. There's this whole big process for how they get appointed. And they are the ones, it's that board that will be the ones to decide whether or not this plays out like it did the last 15 years, where the money goes in and we see some changes, but not as many, or whether we see real accountability to the money.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I would just add that accountability was sort of the buzzword of the Republicans when they were arguing against, at least in the House, when they were arguing against this bill. And so the AIB and creation of the AIB is a really fundamental part of this bill, and sort of called them out on the fact that, we believe in accountability for our dollars. We want these dollars to go to good use and be spent well so that they're actually changing outcomes. And so the AIB was, again, trying to sort of foresee that there was going to be this call for independent investigations. And then, there's sort of, I mean, let's be honest, in Maryland, in the state legislature, often it's like, oh, well, Baltimore, they get all this money and they're not getting better. And there's these really racially veiled threats about it. And so the accountability board is a really important piece to make sure that the money is getting where it needs to go, but also on the political side of it to say, no, we also believe in accountability and we are going to make sure that the money is going where it's going to go. So don't try to tell us that we're increasing funding and being reckless, because we're not. We are going to make sure that this money gets to the kids who need it.
I want to switch gears quickly with the few minutes that we have left and just ask a question around college and career readiness. Can you outline the work being done around pathways for 11th and 12th graders and ensuring that students are college and career ready by the 10th grade? You know, you rattled off some of those statistics around, you know, being certified or some sort of certificate, you know, an AA or a BA just to be able to apply to a job here in Maryland. And given, I think, your work, you know, prior to working in a high school, teaching the 9th and 10th graders, I think you have a unique lens into this, but would you mind just talking a little bit about the college and career readiness portion of this?
Sure. So the funding that goes in for the CCR, college and career readiness, there's sort of three different pathways. There's the AP-IB pathway, which is one, which I think we're all aware of. There's the dual enrollment pathway, which I think is becoming a lot more prevalent out there that students can travel through. Or there is the industry recognized credential CTE pathway. So there's the three different branches of CCR that every child, and I think the fundamental challenge that we will have, and I think is so important, is that each one of the three is as good as the other two. So if you pick one, it is as esteemed or as distinguished as the other two that you do not pick. That is going to be our single biggest challenge, but the most important aspect. If you did an industry recognized credential after 10th grade and 11th and 12th, that's your pathway that you're focusing on, that is as good as doing IB or AP. That is our cultural challenge. You know, I think this is where the biggest opportunity exists. We shifted from 12th grade as the analysis point to 10th grade as the analysis point, and 11th and 12th grade now are in this. We want college and career readiness to be done at 10th grade, and then there are those three pathways for 11th and 12th. But we have a long way to go. Across the state of Maryland right now, last year, there were a total of 246 youth apprentices across the entire state and that's that industry recognized apprenticeship. We have CTE pathways. Very, very few of them actually have an industry recognized credential. And right now, as school districts are putting in their new plans, almost every district is saying we're doing CTE fine. Every single one. And so this is where the rub is going to be. That you know, these are it's a big change to set up a bunch of youth apprenticeships that have real skills and pathways. And so, you know, it's the most exciting part, I think, for implementation over the next 10 years, but it's also going to be the hardest.
I don't have anything to add to what Senator Ferguson said, but I do want to make two quick points that I think would be relevant to anybody else who's working on legislation. Is one, for those who don't know about it, the community eligibility provision is a really essential and important component of making sure that kids can get access to free and reduced free meals for breakfast and lunch. So it was a federal law that was passed. Your state can opt into it. And what it allows is that if you are at a high poverty school, a Title I school, your school can give free, if it opts in, can give free breakfast and lunch to every student. So it totally erases the stigma of getting free lunch and free breakfast. And if you're a high poverty district, your district can opt in. So Baltimore City, at every public school in Baltimore City, they get free breakfast and free lunch. And it's a really important component of school funding and it takes a lot of burdens away from the principals and the educators at their schools to not have to collect all the forms. On the opposite side, when we're not collecting forms, we are not always actually counting poverty accurately. So if you represent a very rural district, or you represent a district that has a high number of undocumented immigrants like we do, those are often people who live there who are not participating in Medicaid or in federal government programs, so they are not being counted accurately at their school. So their school might not be counting them as in poverty. So This happens a lot in rural Maryland, where people, even if they are eligible, do not want to be getting money from SNAP or TANF or anything. And it also happens with undocumented immigrants, of course, who are not eligible. So I just say, if you're a legislator or a mayor or a state councilor or a county council member, those are things to look into to help to make sure you're keeping that in mind for your district. And the one other final thing I wanted to mention is a very political part of this and how you actually pass these bills. And a lot of it really is district by district and counting the votes, right? Making sure that you have the votes in each district, even in those purple districts, or sometimes if you're in a Republican legislature, especially in those purple districts, to make sure that you can have the votes. There was an outside organization called Strong Schools Maryland that developed to support passage of the blueprint for Maryland's future. They were a full-on campaign organizing people around the blueprint for Maryland's future, especially in those purple districts. They were doing polling in those districts, focus groups in those districts, talking to people about reaching out to their legislators to make sure that they voted in favor of the blueprint for Maryland's future. So this was a real team effort to develop the legislation and to have the good policy, but then also an outside group to make sure that we had support when we were passing it.
Well, you took my last question, and you just ran with it. So I think we're at time. I think a lot of great information here shared. As a resident of Maryland, I'm really excited about this. And as someone who has schools in the Montgomery Counties, kids in the schools in Montgomery County, I'm really excited to see how this is all going to turn out. So why don't you join me in giving Senator Ferguson and Comptroller-elect Lierman a round of applause. Thank you so much. And obviously, you can go on the website and check out the blueprint. You can go, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you if you have any further questions. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. Have a great rest of the afternoon.